The morning sun was just starting to shine through the tall windows of the ABC television studio in New York City. It was October 15th, and the building was already buzzing with activity. Workers rushed around with coffee cups in their hands, checking cameras and making sure everything was ready for another live show. Whoopi Goldberg sat in her dressing room, looking at herself in the mirror while a makeup artist worked on her face. She had been doing this job for many years now, and mornings like this felt normal to her. The View was one of the most popular talk shows on television, and millions of people watched it every day. Whoopi was used to talking to all kinds of guests, movie stars, politicians, writers, and regular people with interesting stories. Today felt like any other day. She had her notes spread out on the small table next to her chair. The papers told her about the people who would be coming on the show. Most of them seemed pretty ordinary. There was a woman who had written a cookbook, a man who rescued dogs, and then there was someone called Sergeant James Mitchell. Whoopi picked up the paper about Sergeant Mitchell and read it again. He was a British soldier who had worked as a royal guard. That meant he was one of those soldiers who stood outside Buckingham Palace and protected the Queen and her family. Whoopi had seen them in movies and on TV before. They wore those tall black hats and red uniforms, and they never moved or talked while they were on duty. The paper said that Sergeant Mitchell had written a book about his 20 years of working as a royal guard. He wanted to talk about what it was really like to have that job. Whoopi thought it might be interesting. She had always wondered what those guards were thinking when they stood there so still while tourists took pictures with them. She looked at her watch. It was almost time for the show to start. Whoopi got up from her chair and walked down the long hallway toward the studio. The walls were covered with pictures of all the famous people who had been on The View over the years. Presidents, singers, actors. They were all there, smiling at the camera. When Whoopi walked into the studio, she could see that everything was ready. The audience was filling up the seats. There were about 200 people there, mostly women, and they all looked excited to be part of a live television show. Some of them waved at Whoopi when they saw her. She waved back and smiled. The other hosts were already sitting at the curved desk where they did the show. Joy Behar was reading through her notes and laughing at something. Sarah Haynes was talking to one of the producers about something important. They all looked ready to start another day of television. Whoopi sat down in her usual spot and looked out at the audience. She could see the cameras pointing at them and the big lights that made everything look bright and clear for people watching at home. There were TV screens everywhere showing what the cameras were seeing. It was like being inside a big, complicated machine that was designed to entertain people. A young woman with a headset and a clipboard came over to Whoopi. She was one of the producers who helped make sure the show went smoothly. "Whoopi," she said, "Sergeant Mitchell is here. He's in the green room getting ready. Do you want to meet him before we bring him out?" Whoopi shook her head. "No, that's okay. I like to meet the guests for the first time on camera. It feels more real that way." This was something Whoopi always did. She thought the conversations were more interesting when they were completely natural. The producer nodded and walked away. Whoopi could hear the music that played at the beginning of the show starting to play softly. That meant they had about 5 minutes before they would be live on television, broadcasting to millions of people across the country. She thought about Sergeant Mitchell again. She wondered what he would be like. Would he be serious and formal, like she imagined British soldiers to be? Or would he be funny and relaxed? It was always hard to tell until you started talking to someone. From where she was sitting, Whoopi could see into the green room through a small window. The green room was where guests waited before they came on the show. she could see a man sitting there by himself. He was wearing a nice suit, and he looked calm and patient. That must be Sergeant Mitchell, she thought. Even from far away, she could see that he was sitting very straight in his chair. His hands were folded in his lap, and he wasn't looking at his phone or fidgeting like most people did when they were nervous about being on television. He looked like someone who was used to waiting and staying focused. The music got louder, and one of the camera operators held up his hand to show that they would be starting soon. Whoopi took a deep breath and looked at her notes one more time. She had questions written down about what it was like to guard the royal family and whether the guards ever got tired of standing still for so long. 10 seconds! Someone shouted from behind the cameras. The audience got quiet, and Whoopi could feel that familiar excitement that came right before they went live. This was the moment when everything had to be perfect, because once they started, millions of people would be watching every word they said. The red light on the main camera turned on, which meant they were now broadcasting live. Whoopi smiled at the camera and started talking. "Good morning, everyone, and welcome to The View. We have a great show for you today, including a very special guest who has some amazing stories to tell us." She went through the usual opening of the show, talking about what they would be discussing and introducing the other hosts. The audience clapped and cheered at all the right moments. Everything was going exactly the way it always did. After they talked about the day's news and current events for a while, it was time to bring out Sergeant Mitchell. Whoopi looked at the camera and smiled. "Our next guest spent 20 years as a royal guard protecting the British royal family. He has written a book about his experiences, and I think you're going to find his stories fascinating. Please welcome Sergeant James Mitchell." The audience clapped as Sergeant Mitchell walked out from behind the set. Whoopi got her first good look at him as he walked toward them. He was a tall man with short gray hair and a serious face. He walked with perfect posture, like someone who had spent years learning how to carry himself properly. What caught Whoopi's attention right away was the shiny metal pinned to his jacket. It was about the size of a large coin, and it caught the studio lights as he moved. Whoopi had seen lots of people wear medals and pins before, but this one seemed different somehow. It looked old and important, but she didn't know what it was for. Sergeant Mitchell shook hands with all the hosts and sat down in the guest chair. He smiled politely and thanked them for having him on the show. His British accent was clear but not too strong, and he seemed comfortable being there. As they started talking, Whoopi found herself looking at that medal again and again. She wondered what it was and why he had chosen to wear it on television. It was definitely going to be an interesting conversation. The interview with Sergeant Mitchell was going well. He was telling stories about his time as a royal guard that made the audience laugh and gasp in surprise. He talked about standing guard in the rain for hours, and about the funny things tourists would do to try to make the guards move or smile. "One time," Sergeant Mitchell said with a small smile, "a little girl came up to me while I was on duty. She stood right in front of me and started doing a dance trying to make me laugh. Her mother was so embarrassed, but I have to admit it was one of the hardest things I ever did to keep a straight face." The audience loved stories like this. They could picture the scene in their minds, and it made the royal guard seem more human and less like statues. Whoopi was enjoying the conversation too, but she kept finding her eyes going back to that shiny medal on his jacket. During the first commercial break, Whoopi turned to Joy Behar, who was sitting next to her. "Did you see that big medal he's wearing?" she whispered. "It's so shiny and fancy. I wonder what it's for." Joy glanced over at Sergeant Mitchell, who was talking quietly with one of the producers during the break. "I don't know," she whispered back. Military people always have lots of pins and medals. They probably give them out for all sorts of things. Sarah Haynes leaned over to join the conversation. My grandfather was in the army, she said quietly. He had a whole box of medals, but he never really talked about what they were for. Some of them looked pretty fancy, too. Whoopi nodded, but she was still curious about Sergeant Mitchell's medal. It looked different from the military medals she had seen before. It seemed older and more important somehow. But she didn't want to interrupt the production staff to ask about it. 30 seconds until we're back, called out one of the camera operators. Everyone got back into their positions, and Sergeant Mitchell straightened his tie. The medal caught. The light again as he moved, and Whoopi found herself staring at it. The red light came back on, and they were live again. Whoopi continued asking Sergeant Mitchell about his experiences. He told them about the long hours and the strict training that Royal Guards had to go through. He explained how they learned to stand perfectly still for hours at a time, and how they dealt with all kinds of weather. The worst part wasn't the rain or the cold, Sergeant Mitchell said. It was the boredom. Sometimes you would stand in the same spot for 4 hours without anything happening. You had to learn how to keep your mind busy while your body stayed perfectly still. That sounds incredibly difficult, Sarah said. How did you do it for 20 years? You learned to find meaning in the job, he replied. You're not just standing there for no reason. You're protecting people who are important to your country. That makes all the difficult parts worth it. Whoopi was listening to his answers, but part of her mind was still thinking about that medal. She decided that during the next commercial break, she would ask him about it. But as the conversation continued, she found herself getting more and more curious. Finally, she couldn't wait any longer. While Sergeant Mitchell was answering a question from Joy about whether he had ever met the Queen personally, Whoopi's attention went back to the medal. It really was quite large and shiny, and it seemed out of place on his regular business suit. When there was a pause in the conversation, Whoopi decided to bring it up. She thought it would be a light and fun way to learn more about his military background. After all, people loved hearing about military traditions and honors. Now, Sergeant Mitchell, Whoopi said with a big smile, I have to ask you about something. I keep noticing that beautiful shiny medal you're wearing on your jacket. She gestured toward his chest, and the camera zoomed in to get a better look at it. The medal was indeed very impressive looking. It was made of bronze and had intricate designs on it. There was a small ribbon attached to it in purple and red colors. To most people watching, it just looked like an important military decoration. But they didn't know what it represented. I mean, it's really quite fancy, Whoopi continued, her smile getting bigger. Did you get that from a cereal box, or is that one of those participation trophies they give out these days? She laughed as she said it, thinking she was being playful and funny. The audience laughed too, thinking it was just typical Whoopi humor. She was known for making jokes and being casual with her guests. It seemed like harmless fun, the kind of light teasing that happened on talk shows all the time. Joy and Sarah smiled too, though Sarah looked a little uncertain. She had been raised in a military family, and she knew that military people took their medals seriously, but Whoopi seemed so confident and playful that Sarah didn't want to interrupt. I mean, it's very shiny and all, Whoopi went on, really getting into her joke now. But it looks like something you'd win at a carnival game. You know, like when you throw rings onto bottles and win a prize? She made a throwing motion with her hand, which made the audience laugh even more. The cameras were still focused on the medal, showing it in close-up on television screens across the country. Millions of people were now looking at this decoration that Whoopi was joking about, not knowing what it really was or what it meant. But something was changing in the studio. The producers behind the cameras had stopped moving around and were now watching the stage very carefully. A few of them looked worried, like they knew something that others didn't. Sergeant Mitchell's face had changed too, though it was subtle. His smile had disappeared, and his jaw looked tight. His hands, which had been resting comfortably on the arms of his chair, slowly moved to his lap and formed into fists. "Maybe you got it from one of those machines at the arcade," Whoopi continued, not noticing the change in Mitchell's expression. "You know, the ones where you put in a quarter and try to grab a prize with that metal claw? This looks like it could be a really good prize from one of those." The audience was still laughing, but some of the people in the front rows were starting to notice that Sergeant Mitchell didn't look happy anymore. His face had become very serious, and he was sitting perfectly still in a way that reminded people of how the Royal Guards stood at their posts. One of the producers in the control room was frantically looking through notes, trying to find information about Sergeant Mitchell's medal. He had a feeling that Whoopi was making a big mistake, but it was too late to stop her now. They were live on television and millions of people were watching. "Seriously, though," Whoopi said, finally starting to notice that something was wrong. "What is it really? Some kind of service medal? Did you get it for good attendance or something?" She was still trying to keep the mood light, but her voice had lost some of its confidence. The studio had become much quieter. Even the audience had stopped laughing and was looking back and forth between Whoopi and Sergeant Mitchell. The energy in the room had completely changed, and everyone could feel that something important was happening. Sergeant Mitchell sat in complete silence for what felt like a very long time. It was actually only about 15 seconds, but on live television, 15 seconds of silence feels like forever. He was looking directly at Whoopi, and his expression was unlike anything the audience had seen before. His military training was showing. This was a man who had spent decades learning how to control his emotions and stay calm under pressure. But there was something in his eyes that showed he was fighting to stay composed. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of this unexpected moment. The producers didn't know what to do. Should they go to a commercial break? Should they try to change the subject? But before anyone could make a decision, Sergeant Mitchell finally spoke. His voice was very quiet, but it carried across the entire studio. Every person there could hear the controlled emotion in his words. "Ms. Goldberg," he said, his British accent stronger than it had been all morning, "this carnival prize is the Victoria Cross." The words Victoria Cross hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded. Most of the audience didn't immediately understand what those words meant, but they could tell from the way Sergeant Mitchell had said them that this was something very serious and very important. Whoopi's face went completely blank. She had never heard of the Victoria Cross before, and she didn't understand why Sergeant Mitchell suddenly looked so serious. But she could feel that the mood in the studio had completely changed. The audience was dead silent, and even the camera operators had stopped moving. Joy Behar was sitting next to Whoopi, and she had a confused look on her face, too. She leaned forward slightly, as if she was trying to understand what was happening. Sarah Haynes looked like she might know what the Victoria Cross was, because her face had gone pale, and she was staring at Sergeant Mitchell with wide eyes. "The Victoria Cross," Sergeant Mitchell repeated, his voice still quiet but very clear. He reached up slowly and carefully unpinned the medal from his jacket. His movements were precise and careful, like someone handling something incredibly valuable and fragile. He held the medal up so that everyone in the studio could see it clearly. The cameras zoomed in on it, and for the first time, viewers at home could see all the details. It was made of bronze that had turned dark with age. There were words engraved on it, and the ribbon was a deep purple color with a red stripe through the middle. "This medal," Sergeant Mitchell said, looking directly at Whoopi, "is given for acts of extreme bravery in the face of enemy action. It is the highest military honor that can be awarded in the British military." His voice was steady, but everyone could hear the emotion underneath it. The audience was completely silent now. Even the people who didn't know much about military history could understand that this was something extraordinary. The way Sergeant Mitchell was holding the medal and talking about it made it clear that this was not just any ordinary military decoration. "I received this medal on May 3, 2019, he continued. "It was awarded to me for my actions during a terrorist attack on Buckingham Palace." The word terrorist made several people in the audience gasp. This was not what anyone had expected to hear on a morning talk show. Whoopi was staring at Sergeant Mitchell with her mouth slightly open. She was beginning to understand that she had made a terrible mistake, but she didn't know how terrible yet. The medal in his hands was not a toy or a participation trophy. It was something that represented real danger and real heroism. "On that day," Sergeant Mitchell continued, "3 armed men managed to get past the outer security and enter the palace grounds. They had guns, explosives, and a plan to take hostages." His voice remained calm and factual, like he was giving a report. To his commanding officer, "I was on duty at the main entrance when the attack began. The first thing I heard was gunshots coming from inside the palace. Then I saw people running and screaming. That's when my training took over." Sarah Haynes had tears in her eyes now. She was beginning to understand the full weight of what had happened and what Whoopi had just joked about. The other hosts looked shocked and confused, but Sarah seemed to grasp the seriousness of the situation. "There were 17 civilians in the palace that day," Sergeant Mitchell went on. "They were part of a tour group that included families with children. 2 of the children were only 6 and 8 years old. When the attack started, these people were trapped inside with armed terrorists. The studio was so quiet that you could hear the air conditioning running. Even the production crew had stopped what they were doing to listen to this story. This was not the light-hearted interview that anyone had planned for. During the 40-minute siege, I engaged 2 of the attackers directly. The first one was in the main hallway, trying to reach the tour group. I was able to stop him, but I took a bullet in my shoulder in the process." Sergeant Mitchell paused for a moment, and his free hand moved unconsciously to his left shoulder, as if he was remembering the pain. "The second attacker was more difficult. He was better trained and better armed. Our fight lasted nearly 10 minutes, and during that time I was shot twice more, once in the leg and once in the chest." Whoopi's hands were now covering her mouth. She was beginning to understand the full scope of what she had done. This was not a story about standing guard and dealing with tourists. This was a story about life and death, about saving innocent people from terrorists. "But the third attacker was the most dangerous," Sergeant Mitchell continued. "He had cornered the tour group in the palace gift shop. When I got there, he was holding his gun on those 2 young children. Their parents were begging him not to hurt them." The emotion in his voice was becoming stronger now, though he was still maintaining his military composure. "That's when I made the decision that earned me this medal. I stepped between the gunmen and those children. I used my own body as a shield to protect them." Several people in the audience were crying now. This was not what they had come to see on a morning talk show. They had expected light entertainment and celebrity gossip, not a story about a man risking his life to save children. "The terrorist shot me 4 more times while I was shielding those children. The bullets hit me in the chest, back, and leg. But I stayed between him and those kids until the backup security forces arrived and neutralized the threat." Sergeant Mitchell looked down at the medal in his hands. I spent 6 months in the hospital after that day. The doctors had to perform 14 different surgeries to save my left arm. For a while, they thought they might have to amputate it. He looked back up at Whoopi, and his eyes were full of pain. Not physical pain, but the pain of remembering that terrible day. This medal represents the worst day of my life, but also the day I'm most proud of, because everyone went home safe that day. Those 2 children got to go home to their families because I was willing to take those bullets. The studio was completely silent, except for the quiet sounds of people crying. Whoopi looked like she was going to be sick. She was finally understanding what she had done. She had made fun of a medal that represented incredible courage and sacrifice. Only 358 Victoria Crosses have been awarded since the medal was created in 1856. Sergeant Mitchell said, his voice becoming stronger again. I am one of only 4 people alive today who have received this honor. The last person to receive it before me was 8 years earlier, and that was awarded to a soldier who threw himself on a grenade to save his unit in Afghanistan. He didn't survive to wear his medal. Joy Behar was staring at her hands, unable to look up. Sarah Haynes was wiping tears from her eyes and trying not to let the cameras see her crying. The entire studio felt like it was holding its breath. This medal is not a prize, Ms. Goldberg, Sergeant Mitchell said quietly. It's a reminder of the price that some people pay to keep others safe. Every time I put it on, I remember those children's faces, and I remember how close we all came to a tragedy that day. He carefully pinned the Victoria Cross back onto his jacket, and the simple action seemed to carry enormous weight. The medal looked different now to everyone watching. It was no longer just a shiny object. It was a symbol of courage and sacrifice that most people could never imagine. The cameras captured every detail of this moment, and millions of people watching at home were seeing one of the most powerful and unexpected moments in television history. What had started as a joke had become a lesson in heroism and the real cost of freedom. The silence in the studio was unlike anything anyone there had ever experienced. It was the kind of silence that comes after something so powerful and unexpected that people need time to process what they just heard. The only sounds were the quiet hum of the television equipment and the soft crying of some audience members who were trying not to make noise. Whoopi Goldberg's face had gone through several changes during Sergeant Mitchell's story. First, there had been confusion when he mentioned the Victoria Cross. Then came understanding as he began to explain what had happened. Now her face showed something that the viewers had rarely seen from her: complete shock and what looked like the beginning of real shame. Her usual quick wit and confident manner had completely disappeared. Whoopi was known for always having something to say, for being able to handle any situation with humor or smart comments. But now she sat there, looking smaller somehow, like the weight of what she had done was pressing down on her shoulders. The camera operators didn't know what to do. They were used to capturing funny moments, celebrity interviews, and light entertainment. But this was something completely different. One of the cameramen later said that he had been doing television for 20 years, and he had never filmed anything as intense as this moment. In the control room, the producers were having urgent whispered conversations. Should they cut to a commercial break? Should they try to change the subject? But they were also aware that they were witnessing something truly extraordinary. This was the kind of television moment that people would remember and talk about for years. The audience was struggling with their own emotions. Many of them had laughed along with Whoopi's jokes about the medal just minutes before. Now they felt terrible about it. They had been part of something that seemed funny at the time, but now felt cruel and wrong. Mrs. Patterson, who was sitting in the third row, later told reporters that she felt sick to her stomach. When he started talking about those children, and how he protected them, I just felt awful, she said. I had laughed when Whoopi made those jokes, and now I realized we were laughing at a hero. Sarah Haynes was the first of the hosts to show visible emotion. Tears were running down her face, and she wasn't trying to hide them anymore. Her grandfather had been in World War II, and she had grown up hearing stories about the sacrifices that soldiers made. She understood better than the others what Sergeant Mitchell's medal really meant. Joy Behar, who was usually quick with jokes and comments, was staring down at her hands. She looked like she was trying to figure out what to say, but nothing seemed appropriate. How do you follow a story like that? How do you make conversation after hearing about someone taking bullets to protect children? Sergeant Mitchell had finished speaking and was now sitting quietly in his chair. He had told his story in the same calm, professional way that he had. Probably told it to military investigators and medal committees. But everyone could see that it was not easy for him to talk about. His hands were steady, but there was a tightness around his eyes that showed the emotional cost of remembering. That day, the medal on his jacket now seemed to glow under the studio lights. It looked completely different than it had just 10 minutes earlier. Before, it had seemed like just another piece of military decoration. Now, everyone in the studio understood that they were looking at one of the rarest and most meaningful honors that anyone could receive. In homes across America, people were having their own reactions to what they had just witnessed. The show's phone lines had started ringing almost immediately. Viewers were calling to express their shock, their support for Sergeant Mitchell, and their disappointment in what had happened. Social media was exploding with comments and shares. People were posting clips of the moment when Whoopi made her jokes, followed by clips of Sergeant Mitchell's response. The contrast was stark and painful to watch. Many people were expressing anger at Whoopi, while others were defending her, saying that she couldn't have known what the medal represented. Military families across the country were particularly affected by what they saw. They understood the weight of military honors in a way that civilians often didn't. For them, watching someone mock a Victoria Cross was like watching someone make fun of a Medal of Honor or a Purple Heart. Colonel Robert Jensen, a retired Army officer watching from his home in Texas, called the incident heartbreaking. He later said, "That medal represents the highest level of courage and sacrifice. To see it treated as a joke, even accidentally, was very difficult to watch. But the most powerful reactions were coming from the studio audience. These were people who had come for a fun morning of television, maybe hoping to see some celebrities or hear some interesting stories. Instead, they had witnessed one of the most emotionally intense moments ever broadcast on daytime television." The woman sitting behind Mrs. Patterson was quietly sobbing. She was thinking about her own son, who was serving in the military overseas. The idea that someone might someday make fun of his service medals was too painful to consider. An elderly man in the back row was remembering his brother, who had died in Vietnam. His brother had received several medals for his service, and those medals were now the family's most treasured possessions. Watching Sergeant Mitchell's story brought back all those memories of loss and sacrifice. The studio crew was also affected by what they had witnessed. The sound engineer, who had been working in television for 15 years, later said that he had to take a break after the show because he was too emotional to work. "I've recorded thousands of interviews," he said, "but I've never heard anything like that man's story." The makeup artist who had worked on Whoopi that morning watched from the side of the studio. She could see that Whoopi was struggling with what had happened. The confident, funny woman who had sat in the makeup chair a few hours earlier was gone, replaced by someone who looked lost and ashamed. Even the security guards at the studio entrances were affected. When they heard what had happened, many of them thought about their own military service or that of their family members. The security supervisor, a former Marine, said later that he felt proud of how Sergeant Mitchell had handled the situation with such dignity. The commercial break that followed seemed to last forever, even though it was only 3 minutes long. During those 3 minutes, the studio remained almost completely silent. Nobody knew what to say or how to continue the show after what had just happened. Sergeant Mitchell sat quietly in his chair, occasionally adjusting his jacket or checking his watch. He looked tired, as if telling his story had taken a lot out of him. But he also looked dignified and strong, like someone who had faced much worse situations than an awkward television interview. Whoopi was having whispered conversations with the producers. Everyone could see that she was upset, but they also knew that the show had to continue. Millions of people were watching, and they couldn't just end the broadcast. But how do you continue a light entertainment show after a moment like this? When the red light came back on, indicating that they were live again, everyone in the studio held their breath. This was going to be one of the most important moments in the history of The View, and everyone knew it. When the red light came back on, and The View returned from commercial break, the studio was still heavy with emotion. The audience sat quietly, waiting to see what would happen next. Everyone could feel that this was no longer a typical morning talk show. Something profound had changed, and nobody was quite sure how to move forward. Whoopi Goldberg took a deep breath and looked directly into the camera. For a moment, she seemed to be gathering her courage, like someone preparing to do something very difficult. When she began to speak, her voice was shaky in a way that millions of viewers had never heard before. "Before we continue," Whoopi said, her hands trembling slightly, "I need to say something, and I need to say it right now, while we're live on television." She turned to face Sergeant Mitchell, and for the first time since his story began, she looked directly into his eyes. "Sergeant Mitchell," she continued, and now everyone could see that she was fighting back tears, "I owe you an apology that goes far beyond what words can express. I made assumptions about something I knew nothing about, and in doing so, I dishonored not just you, but every person who has ever served and sacrificed for their country." The studio remained completely silent. This was not the kind of moment that usually happened on daytime television. Celebrities and talk show hosts rarely apologize so publicly and so completely, but everyone watching could see that this was coming from a real place of regret and shame. "I thought I was being funny," Whoopi went on, her voice getting stronger, but still emotional. "I thought I was just making light conversation about a piece of jewelry, but I realize now that what I did was mock something sacred. I made fun of courage. I made jokes about sacrifice. And I did it in front of millions of people." Tears were now running down her face, and she made no attempt to hide them. "I am ashamed of what I said. And I am sorry in a way that I have never been sorry before. You risked your life to save children, and I repaid that heroism by making carnival jokes. That is unforgivable." The audience was completely captivated by what they were seeing. This was not a typical celebrity apology that sounded scripted or insincere. This was raw, honest emotion from someone who had made a serious mistake and truly understood the weight of what she had done. What happened next surprised everyone in the studio, including the producers who thought they might know how Sergeant Mitchell would respond. Instead of accepting the apology with the formal politeness that people expected from a British military officer, he did something that nobody anticipated. Sergeant Mitchell leaned forward in his chair and gently placed his hand on Whoopi's shoulder. The gesture was kind and paternal, like a father comforting a child who had made an honest mistake. "Ms. Goldberg," he said softly, "we all make mistakes. What matters is not that we make them, but what we do after we realize we've made them." His voice was warm and understanding, completely different from the serious tone he had used when telling his story. Your willingness to apologize so publicly, so honestly, shows the character that has made you successful in your career and respected by so many people. I accept your apology completely, and I hope we can use this moment to help people understand the weight that some of these medals carry. The audience burst into applause. It was not the polite, automatic clapping that usually happened on talk shows. This was genuine appreciation for both Whoopi's honest apology and Sergeant Mitchell's gracious response. Many people in the audience were crying openly now, moved by the humanity and dignity that both people had shown. Sarah Haynes, who had been quietly crying throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. "Sergeant Mitchell," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "could you tell us more about the Victoria Cross? I think a lot of people watching would like to understand its history and what it represents." This question seemed to energize Sergeant Mitchell in a positive way. His face brightened, and he sat up straighter in his chair. "I would be honored to," he said. The Victoria Cross was created by Queen Victoria in 1856. It's made from bronze that came from Russian cannons captured during the Crimean War. As he spoke, his voice took on the tone of a teacher who loved his subject. What makes the Victoria Cross special is not just its rarity, but the level of courage required to earn it. The official criteria state that it must be awarded for most conspicuous bravery or some daring or preeminent act of valor or self-sacrifice or extreme devotion to duty in the presence of the enemy. The audience was listening intently. Many of them had never heard of the Victoria Cross before this morning, and they were learning about one of the world's most prestigious military honors from someone who had actually earned it. The medal itself is quite simple, Sergeant Mitchell continued, touching the cross on his jacket. It's not made of gold or silver like some military honors. It's made of bronze, because the honor comes not from expensive materials, but from the actions it represents. Joy Behar, who had been quiet for most of the segment, finally found her voice. "Can you tell us about some of the other people who have received this medal?" she asked. Sergeant Mitchell's eyes lit up. "Oh, there have been some remarkable people," he said. During World War I, a young soldier named Jack Cornwall was awarded the Victoria Cross when he was only 16 years old. He stayed at his post on a naval ship even after being mortally wounded, continuing to serve his gun until the battle was over. He went on to tell story after story of ordinary people who had done extraordinary things. There was the soldier who single-handedly captured an enemy machine gun position despite being wounded multiple times. There was the pilot who flew his damaged plane back to base to save his crew, knowing that he probably wouldn't survive the landing. Each one of these medals, Sergeant Mitchell said, represents someone who chose to put others before themselves when it mattered most. That's what makes the Victoria Cross special. It's not about being a perfect soldier or following orders. It's about making the choice to be brave when everything inside you is telling you to run away. The show had now gone well over its usual time, but nobody seemed to care. The producers had decided to let the conversation continue because they knew they were witnessing something special. Phone calls and social media posts were pouring in from viewers who were learning about military history and heroism for the first time. As the extended segment finally came to an end, Whoopi made one more statement that would be remembered long after the show was over. "I want everyone watching to know that I have learned something important today," she said. "I learned that behind every military medal is a story of real people making real sacrifices. I promise that I will never again make assumptions about things I don't understand." She turned back to Sergeant Mitchell. "And I want to thank you for handling my ignorance with such grace. You could have made me feel terrible, but instead you chose to educate and forgive. That takes a different kind of courage, and I'm grateful for it." The show ended with Sergeant Mitchell explaining how people could learn more about military history and the stories behind various medals and honors. He mentioned several museums and websites where families could research their own military heritage. In the days and weeks that followed, the impact of that morning's show continued to grow. The video clips were shared millions of times on social media. Military museums reported huge increases in visitors. Libraries said that books about military history were being checked out at record rates. But perhaps the most meaningful impact was personal. Whoopi Goldberg spent the following weekend visiting wounded veterans at Walter Reed Medical Center. She didn't bring cameras or publicists. She just went to listen to their stories and to better understand the experiences of military service members. A month later, The View announced that they were establishing a scholarship fund for children of fallen service members. The fund was named the Victoria Cross Education Foundation, and Sergeant Mitchell was invited to serve on its board of directors. The incident that had started as an embarrassing mistake had grown into something much larger. It became a reminder that behind every uniform, every medal, and every military story is a real person who made real sacrifices. And it showed that sometimes the most powerful television happens not when everything goes according to plan, but when real human emotions and authentic moments break through the usual scripts and formulas. Years later, both Whoopi and Sergeant Mitchell would say that morning changed their lives. For Whoopi, it was a lesson in humility and the importance of understanding before judging. For Sergeant Mitchell, it was an opportunity to honor his fellow service members and to share their stories with people who might never have heard them otherwise. The interview became required viewing in military history classes and journalism schools. It was studied as an example of how to handle mistakes with grace, how to accept apologies with dignity, and how to turn a moment of embarrassment into an opportunity for education and understanding. Most importantly, it reminded millions of people that heroism is real, that courage matters, and that the medals worn by veterans represent stories of sacrifice that deserve respect and recognition, not jokes and assumptions.